right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 12th AMA. Today, we are joined by Kris and Sam from Protocol Engineering to talk about Maker Wormhole. A lot of people here joined. Sure, there'll be a lot of good questions, so let's just go ahead and jump right into it. I know, Kris, you wanted to go ahead and give some background, so I will pass it over to you.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Kris, and let me kick off this meeting by sharing my screen and presenting and talking briefly about like the whole solution. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. So first of all, like Sam wrote down all the details about Maker Wormhole in the forum, governance forum. So you can read that, but actually, like some details of this design are outdated now. And let me go through the current version and yeah. So first of all, the problem that we want to solve with DAI wormhole is teleporting DAI between different domains. So by domain, I mean basically a layer 2 or even a sidechain that is somehow somehow connected to the Ethereum mainnet. It could be even other different layer 1. Like this system is quite unopinionated. But I guess that our governance will be opinionated. So I'm using domain and layer 2 here, kind of interchangeable. So so we have DAI on one domain like Optimism, and we want to teleport it to another domain like Arbitrum. And so, you know, this is needed for many different reasons, but also like if you have optimistic rollups, you have this problem of slow withdrawals, right? Going through, like withdrawing to layer 1 takes 7 days. So if you would do it like naively, which is like withdraw to layer 1, your DAI first, and then deposit on different domain, it would take like 7 days. But also this mechanism can be useful just to avoid moving a lot of DAI through layer 1, even between like ZK rollups, which don't have this 7-day delay period, right? So this is more or less the context of what we want to do. And now our solution works like this. Users, let's focus first on a more generic case, which is a layer 2 to layer 2 wormhole. So on layer 1, layer 2A, which is in this case Optimist, we have users that call initiate wormhole, and this call burns DAI immediately on this layer 2, and it's emitting some kind of event. And this event is being watched by Maker oracles. So these are totally different Oracle software run by the same team as Oracle for prices that we use for many years in Maker. And with these, so this Oracle provides attestations, which is just like signatures that are exposed by a regular REST API. And anyone can get these attestations that, you know, someone burned some DAI on this Optimism chain. And with these attestations, these users can call, can interact with Wormhole Oracle Auth on a target domain like Arbitrum. And by providing these attestations, they basically prove that they burned some DAI, and with this attestation, fresh new DAI can be minted for them. So this DAI is going to be minted by MCD instance, special vault on MCD instance on this particular domain like Arbitrum, and it's collateralized by a promise of future DAI. So what happens under the hood is that we have a network of keepers that will periodically flush the DAI that was burned on originating domain and move this DAI slowly to the destination domain. So, for example, for optimistic rollups, it will take 7 days to move this DAI from one bridge to another, and then later pay back the debt. So, so this special vault is like giving a loan for 7 days for using this attestation provided by Maker Oracles. So yes, we have, and then we have one more thing, which is a slow path. So this idea works great if we trust Oracle system. And you know, Maker already has some pretty big exposure to our Oracle system, so I think it's fine. But still, Oracles in theory could, for example, censor one particular user, right? And for this special case, we have still something that we call slow path, and basically it's a path that user can take when, you know, Oracle system is down or it doesn't work. So the slow path works in the way that when initial wormhole calls are happening to on the originating bridge, we emit cross-chain messages that that usually are not are never finalized. So the thing about cross-chain messages in case of rollups is that they are very cheap. Like really what happens, I'm thinking now about layer 2 to layer 1 messages. They are really cheap because it's really like a storage write, and that later you need to prove with some Merkle root. So it's really cheap unless you finalize them. And usually we won't be finalizing them. But when user wants to, you know, avoid using oracles, they can finalize it and, you know, get access to their DAI after 7 days, after the dispute period is finished. So we don't expect users to use this path, but it's there as a somehow some kind of security security mechanism. And one thing that I forgot to mention, a very important thing about flashing DAI is that even though this initial wormhole and then minting wormhole happens for every user, flash, so this operation of rebalancing debt between bridges happens once per day or once per some period of time, which means that we gather all the smaller you know, wormholes created by users, and we just settle that at once. And this is where we get scaling benefits. On layer 1, we're just gonna have one transaction per day or even per few days, which is awesome for scaling from scaling perspective. So this is more or less how layer 2 to layer 2 wormhole works. And then there's this special case of layer 2 to layer 1 wormhole, also known as fast withdrawal. And then it's quite similar case, just the difference is that you don't bridge to different domain, but to layer 1. And frankly, the technical solution is also very similar. We have this wormhole router that takes care of like routing the request to either to the bridge or to the MCD instance on layer 1. So really everything works the same way. There are some details about the system like fee structures and so on, but maybe we can, I don't know, Sam, if you want to talk about it, or maybe we can get have some questions and just guide discussion using them.
Yeah, I think there was some questions about fees, so maybe we can just address them there.
Sure. So,
yeah, I think that was a good enough intro. I think you covered everything. So I guess let's get to the questions.
Yeah. Okay. Should I stop sharing or?
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. Peyton did ask in the chat if we plan to charge a fee for the quick withdrawal And I guess along with that, are there planned fees for any other operations?
Yeah, so there's two kind of components to that. I mean, governance can really choose whatever they want, I mean, to charge a fee. So there's sort of like the, do we want to make revenue off this sort of question? And I think that's more thrown to governance, and we can like kind of go with whatever governance wants on that. There's sort of a second component to this, which is due to, as Kris said, the sort of fungible bundling of all the transactions into one block of settlement. It sort of introduces a denial of service attack vector in sort of the naive case where we don't charge a fee. So we're currently sort of doing R&D on like figuring out a way to mitigate this. Likely we will need to charge some fee to sort of prevent people from doing this denial of service attack and just sort of blocking people from getting DAI on the target domain. So yeah, there likely will need to be a fee just for the denial of service, and we can decide to have some sort of revenue component on top of that.
Can you explain the denial of service attack? Because I haven't mentioned that as well.
Yeah, sure. So
can you share, sorry, just Kris, can you share your screen so we can actually visualize where this denial of service might be?
Sure. And I'll just go over it, I guess.
Sure, yeah. So the fee,
you want to go over it?
Quick, no, I wanted to just say one thing. The fee structure that Sam says would be sitting in the wormhole join somewhere here, or actually, let's go for this image. Okay, continue, Sam, sorry.
Right, so during this sort of fast path withdrawal, and it's important there's a debt ceiling on the wormhole debt as well, such that, you know, if there's something goes wrong, you don't want to like just blow up the whole system, right? So we do have a debt ceiling there. So what can happen is let's say somebody, I don't know, they want to take the slow path or whatever to exit and get their DAI out. There is a potential for somebody to basically max out the debt ceiling with the fast withdrawal ahead of them due to the fungibility of sort of the debt. So maybe an example is probably better for this. So let's say somebody has, two people are sort of initiating a wormhole. The debt ceiling is 10 million on Arbitrum. There's two people wanting to go from Optimism to Arbitrum. They both mint, I don't know, 3 million each. And so there's like 6 million going through. And so those two people can sort of do a fast withdrawal. There's ample debt ceiling. They can sort of get their DAI right away. That's fine. Now let's say somebody wants to withdraw, say 4 million, and for whatever reason they've taken the slow path, so they're waiting 7 days. Their DAI that they have burned has already been transferred to the target bridge in that case, so they should, in theory, be able to be served immediately. But what can happen is, let's say somebody comes in with a $10 million transfer request between Optimism to Arbitrum, and they execute the fast withdrawal right away before this user can execute their slow path withdrawal. So in that case, the debt ceiling would be used up, and they would basically block the user who's been waiting for 7 days and should be like more fairly entitled to get the DAI first. So to prevent this, we're coming up with mechanisms that will A, favor those users who have been waiting longer, and B, sort of prevent this denial of service attack vector by people who, if the debt ceiling is heavily utilized all the time, like we can sort of turn up the fees and stuff like that. So this sort of griefing behavior can become more and more expensive. And so we're experimenting here with various designs. But the trade-off here is that, yeah, we get the fungible debt, which is, it's probably something that seems kind of trivial, but it's like a super important piece here. Being able to settle in bulk on layer 1 is the key to scaling this system. Doing sort of closing out these transactions one-to-one is simply just not feasible for scaling up to, you know, hundreds of thousands of, you know, $1 transactions in the future.
Yeah, and we need, like, you know, this wormhole join is just like a regular collateral type in the MCD. So it will have debt sync, and we'll use debt sync as some sort of, you know, risk management mechanism, right? Like we could set up different debt ceilings for different domains to manage, maximum exposure that we have. So in theory, that's why I said that we could even support some domains that are not rollups, that don't share the same security as layer one, because we could manage the exposure via some other mechanism.
Okay, so in order to keep these debt ceilings separate, I assume they would essentially be their own vault types on layer one, or how would that
Yeah,
work?
so maybe that wasn't clear. So this is contingent upon MCD being available on L2s. So we would deploy sort of slave instances of MCD, and that's a prerequisite for this full wormhole solution.
Yeah, and in the case of layer one, like it's enough to have one wormhole join. Like this is kind of technical discussion, but we want to have like one debt ceiling for the whole wormhole join, and then maintain internally inside of this wormhole join like debt ceilings for particular domains. Yeah, it's a technical detail to avoid like deploying n wormhole joins for different domains. Like we're just gonna maintain it internally.
Okay. Peyton also asked in the chat, would we be able to have something like a priority queue for keepers using layer twos to settle liquidations or auctions for us?
Yeah, like is this to like solve the denial of service issue? Is that what this is you're talking about?
Yeah, I believe that's what was being discussed when he put that question.
Might be
Yeah,
related. Might be
so,
related to his question yesterday, though, which is it's about servicing auctions with the liquidity on different networks. I don't know, Peyton, is that what you're targeting?
Do you want to clarify, Peyton? Both? Okay. So for the first one, yeah, part of what we're evaluating is some sort of a way to potentially have a FIFO queue of sort of giving priority from who has initiated the transaction. We're still investigating that. Like that may be useful for preventing denial of service, and so we'll see. And for the auctions thing, so this is priority queue. I guess this is for sort of in the case where there's a big market crash and DAI liquidity runs out on some L2, there's potential to use Wormhole to get there quickly. Yeah, I think that's a great use case for, one L2 has a lack of liquidity and the other one has a bunch of liquidity. Yeah, you can use the the Wormhole rather to get DAI liquidity to where it's needed quickly.
Yeah, although we can't solve the single block composability settlement problem, right? So if you started to try and move that over, that liquidity would move. Let's say you're trying to service an auction that's running on L1 or running on another L2. That auction could clear before your capital made it across the bridge, even in the like multiple blocks that it may take to do that. And so we may need to think a little harder on auctions, but that's actually, I think just more broadly, I think the more exciting thing about this is to think about what the ecosystem even could build on top of this once it's there, right? Because we're talking about just moving DAI from chain to chain. But if you have the right kind of liquidity pools, right, you can move more than just DAI from chain to chain. Like you can basically swap your ETH into DAI and then move the DAI across the wormhole bridge. And then on the other side, you basically throw your DAI into an ETH pool and get your ETH back. So now we can use this as like a DAI as this sort of conduit to move any asset across chain. So, and then I don't know if anyone else has like other ideas that they're thinking of, but I think we want to enable the most amount of like use cases to be able to build on top of this infrastructure. So.
Yeah, I also thought about this. Like, given a really good liquidity on the DAI pairs, like we could think about it as a generic bridge, as long as you're willing to take some slippage on AMMs in and out, right? It's kind of similar to what Hop does, but with DAI instead of like H tokens. There was this question, like Kris, I wanted to come back to your comment about auctions, right? Like regarding auctions, like I think that you still can use flash loans, whatever, like we'll deploy as a part of MCD on layer 2, we'll deploy the flash loan module because someone asked this question on chat. And you could still use like, flash loans on while finalizing auctions, but you're right that there's no like cross-chain composability in one block, but basically the risk parameters, actions parameters should be should be taking into account the liquidity available on a given domain, right? Like instant liquidity given on available on a given domain. So I don't think that to close an action you need actually like cross-chain liquidity. I think like you should be able to just use the liquidity available on the on the given domain.
Yep, we'll have to see how it plays out and what we run into. But yeah, the distinction there was there'll definitely be flash loans on like different layer 2s as well as layer 1, but we lose single block composability when we cross a domain. So that inhibits a bit our current auction mechanism. Although our auction mechanism doesn't necessarily need to be leveraging single block composability, but it will it'll prevent the stronger use cases where that is being leveraged. But yeah, to Chris's point, if we've done our jobs right, then the risk parameters on each domain should account for the liquidity available on those domains. Yeah, I guess the fanciful case is like, let's say auctions are running pretty hard on layer 1, but most users have moved liquidity to layer 2, and there's still a ton of positions on layer 1. Can we easily get liquidity back from layer 2 to service those auctions on layer 1, right? So, and the answer is maybe we can't. Maybe that's just not like a case that we can solve. But with a few blocks in between, you could move liquidity from one to another. But
I will encourage people, if you can, please hop on mic and ask questions. Feel free to jump in when it's appropriate. Lewis asked a question in chat. How much time do we let pass until we consider that a debt in that context is a bad debt? 10 days?
6.5 days right now, but that's configurable. We can change.
We'll have some timeout where I think what this person's talking about is like if the oracles lied and somebody mints some DAI and it's not going to be backed later by the DAI that goes through the slow path. In that case, yeah, we would have some sort of longer delay where we would say, okay, if it hasn't come in by this time, we're going to have to push it as bad debt to the vow.
Thank you.
But yeah, I misunderstood. I thought that was in the context of auctions, but yeah.
Could you speak a bit to like what some of the similarities or differences are between this and some of the other bridges we've seen recently popping up?
Yeah, I can take this question. So our solution is I think that if we take a look at the landscape of similar protocols, like I call them asset teleportation protocols, we have solutions like HOP. We have other solutions using state channels like Connex or a few others. So our solution is definitely much more similar to HOP than to regular state channel solutions. So HOP is quite similar in the way that they do have some kind of keepers, bonders that move debt for many users between domains. But the problem is that HOP doesn't have a way to interact with a native tokens, right? Like if they want to move DAI using some, like they cannot just mint DAI on any domain, right? That's the problem with HOP, and they cannot mint any token on any domain, really, like a native token, canonical token, right? What they can do is introduce their own token and mint that one, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're calling it H tokens, and for example, you have H DAI, H Ether, right? So the problem is that then you need to introduce like some kind of way to swap between H tokens and normal tokens. So basically they have like stable swap AMMs, and this leads basically to some capital inefficiencies, right? Basically you need to have over 300% over collateralization to move like one token, and this is because you have AMMs on both sides, and then you have like a bonder that also says that something happened on one domain, and it also has to present some kind of bond to do that. So really our like competitive advantage here is that we have DAI minting rights as a DAO, right? And basically we have infinite liquidity. And this is also why it's better than like state channel using solutions. Like basically our fees can always be super low because we can mint DAI, you know, as a DAO at will. And another important thing here is that the risk that, you know, this whole solution introduces is not it's not risky for DAI users, it's only risky for the DAO, so for Maker as a token, right? Like if Oracle lies in this solution, it's Maker holders that would get diluted, right? Not DAI users. So this is like the risk in the system is like where it should be, I think.
Another piece I'll add just again about this sort of fungible debt piece is that we get a massive amount of scaling with this sort of design. They're not having to close out transactions one-to-one on L1 is super important. And so by having this fungible debt, we can scale basically infinitely as well with the number of transactions.
Yeah, exactly. This is also something that we do slightly different than other solutions. Like other solutions have usually like some kind of number of transactions that they batch, and we don't care about that. So that's also really nice. So there was a question about like pre-minting DAI. So this is about like deploying MCD on different domains in general. So yeah, maybe we can talk about this now. So so let me answer this quickly. So basically our approach to deploy MCD on a different domain is that so the problem is that when you move DAI to Optimism and Arbitrum, now you always deposit DAI on layer 1, and then you mint, our bridge mints for you the same amount of L2 DAI, Optimism DAI, or Arbitrum DAI, right? So this bridge, if there's like a total number of, I don't know, 1 million DAI on Optimism, this bridge for Optimism always has 1 million DAI locked on layer 1. And now if you just simply deploy MCD on Optimism and allow minting new DAI out of Ether or whatever, when we think about these domains, we also need to think about like native collaterals for these domains, like collaterals that don't exist even on layer 1, right? So if users use this DAI, this MCD instance, let's say that it has 10 million DAI debt ceiling, and you know there's suddenly like 11 million DAI minted on Optimism, but only 1 million DAI locked in the bridge. This means that users wouldn't be able to move from layer 2, from Optimism to mainnet or to Arbitrum, right? So we are developing the system to avoid exactly this problem. This is like the biggest problem that we need to keep in our minds to while moving up MCD to different domains. So the solution that we want to take is that we're gonna pre-mint DAI available on particular layer 2 first on layer 1 and move this liquidity, this DAI, to lock in the bridge. So if we deploy new MCD instance with the 10 million DAI debt ceiling on particular domain, we would pre-mint this 10 million DAI on layer 1 and lock it into the bridge. So even though like no one minted really DAI on layer 2 yet, right? Like we're gonna pre-mint it. So, and then we just redistribute it rather than mint on layer 2. So we're gonna, this can be done in a trustless manner when, this DAI is always locked in the bridges, and it can never, like, it never goes for any multi-sigs or whatever, right? So, so this way, this bridge never runs out of DAI. Like, it's not possible for this bridge to run out of DAI. So DAI is always like fully fungible. You can take DAI from Optimism and move it to Arbitrum or to ZK Sync in the future and so on. So yes, this is a solution to that problem. And there were some questions. Yeah, so Maciej is asking, is DAI locked in layer 1 bridge equal to layer 2 dead sync? No, because it's equal to layer 2 dead sync plus amount of DAI that was bridged manually by the users is equal to total amount of DAI locked on layer 1. So that's we need to also take into account like the DAI that was bridged manually by the users. But more or less, yes. Risk to DAI holders would exist in the end through as collateral would be spread across chains, requiring more transactions to turn DAI into real collateral.
Kris, I can speak to this. I just didn't want to interrupt what you were saying before.
Yeah.
I was just commenting, you mentioned that the risk falls to the MKR holders, not to the DAI holders. And I totally agree with what you were saying, but I think there's an important caveat there that it's during normal operation that risk falls in that way. During emergency shutdown, when DAI holders try to redeem their DAI, there's a more complicated process to get that back, because they would effectively be getting the L2 pre-mint DAI collateral from L1, and they'd have to go kind of redeem that on L2 or like unwind L2 first and then go to L1. So that it makes the emergency shutdown process slightly more complicated, which falls onto the DAI holders.
Oh yeah, maybe I can speak to this a bit. So we haven't even gotten into the L2 MCD design at all, but yes, there is a lot of complexity into the global shutdown process that comes from deploying MCD on L2. So as Kris said, yeah, you have to kind of wind down the L2s and stuff like that. So we do have plans for that. I think it's probably out of scope for this chat, but yeah, we do have a design for that.
Guys, I apologize if you guys went over this. I was a little late. So all DAI has to be backed by collateral, right? Or wrong with this model?
Yep. And the collateral is, in this case, with the wormholing, is the future payment of the DAI.
What does that mean?
So I mean,
you know what I'm saying? We have collateral that backs all L1 DAI, right? And I thought the policy, the goal here is that we want to get all L1 DAI on across L2s, right? So somehow you have to back that L1 DAI with something, or not.
Yeah,
that's what I'm trying to understand.
So in the wormhole case, so we're minting it, and there's no token, but there is sort of it's just to simplify things. But mentally, you can consider it as the token is a NFT, a future promise of the debt being paid in 7 days or whatever. So you can think of that as the wormhole is backed by that. It's just we're kind of ignoring it because it's kind of all internal to Maker. It makes the development of this easier. But in your head, you can totally think of it as like you'll get DAI in 7 days. That backs minting of that same amount of DAI, maybe slightly less due to fees.
Yeah, but what's backing that you'll get DAI in 7 days part, right?
Well, that's backed by
backing in the end for the DAI that's being minted. Yeah.
Right. So that DAI is backed by whatever. I mean, maybe that person minted the DAI with ETH as collateral, like it's backed by the collateral pool of MCD.
I think there's another way of asking a similar question. And I think what you were asking just a moment ago. So if the collateral, if you've got DAI that gets minted from ETH, and this is on a layer 2, is there an aspect to this where really the difference between like an optimistic rollup and a zero knowledge rollup, where it kind of plays into the risk factor of the way you were just saying about DAI needing to be repaid in the future? What is the edge case where like an optimistic rollup just truly blows up?
Yeah, so we protect ourselves with this with debt ceilings. So if it blows up, debt ceilings are going to be potentially maxed out, and we take the loss.
Yeah, and let's talk about this blow up a little bit, because I've been thinking about this. Is that in the loosest sense, and with the L2s, you're kind of rolling these things up. That you have L1 security on a lot of stuff, but then the question is, where does the collateral really sit in an MCD on an L2, right? Can that be pulled back at some point in the future to collateralize the loan, or is there some way that collateral can just vaporize due to some weirdness in the L2? Like, I think of this like a side chain, right, where we have a multi-sig that's in charge, right? And in the loosest sense, that contract gets penetrated, all the assets get drained from the side chain, right? And so then you're stuck with all the stuff in the side chain that isn't backed by anything in the multi-sig anymore. And you go, what do you do, right? What do you do, if anything, to make these people whole? Or where did the collateral go? I mean, the collateral's gone. It's like, how are you going to fill the void, basically, with what? Yeah. And so that's the real question I think we're asking.
Yeah, what would happen? So let's say we have ETH bridged to Optimism. So in the sort of normal case, the bridge is sort of hopefully developed well, and doesn't have any bugs or anything. You put your ETH in the ETH bridge, which is completely separate outside of our system, and then you get a token on L2 that is, as long as the bridge is functioning correctly and the security models are all good, that's fully fungible with the ETH on L1. So we would use that as collateral. It's not exactly ETH, but it's like pretty close, and we use that as collateral on Optimism MCD. Now, the oracles need to take into account that, let's say there's a bug and somebody drains the L1 side of that ETH bridge, and now ETH on Optimism becomes worthless because you can't redeem it. That would be a case just where ETH price on Optimism goes to zero, and we would liquidate the vaults. We would not get anything in return because it's gone to zero, and we would just take the loss.
But then this loss basically can potentially affect all the other chains in some loose sense, right? Meaning, like, while the loss is not filled, we saw this during, when you have a surplus buffer that's negative, which might not even be negative at the time, that this DAI to cover the loss may still have to wind its way around, so to speak, that you run around in principle with DAI that's unbacked, right? And so it hazards all DAI across all chains, including L1 in the loosest sense. And I was trying to think of a way to compartmentalize this risk, but the problem is DAI is ubiquitous. So it's entirely unclear. DAI on an Optimism L2 is exactly the same as DAI on a different L2. And so you end up stuck with this problem that all risk is borne across all chains on all DAI, because the goal is you want all DAI to be ubiquitous. And so we have to think carefully about that.
Yeah, just because the DAI is fungible, though, doesn't mean we would just like nuke the whole system. So in this case, where there's a catastrophic bug in ETH, basically what would happen in the worst case is the Optimism MCD would max out the debt ceilings for ETH. There would take a maximum DAI loan. That DAI would still be fungible with L1, and Maker would just take a loss in the amount of the debt ceilings of that particular rollup. So it would be contained to those debt ceilings. We could potentially survive this event depending on how big the debt ceilings are.
So that same, following on that thinking though, is, and again, I know it's an edge case, but it's still worth going down. Like with an optimistic rollup, there is a chance that it just, whatever, it explodes. Does that same type of risk factor happen with a zero knowledge rollup? AKA, will we end up with a debt ceiling on optimistic rollups that's, I'm making up a number, 10 million, and the zero knowledge rollup would be 10 billion? Are we going to handle it something like that?
The risk profiles are definitely different between the rollups. We need to evaluate that, but it's all kind of the same at the application layer. We just view them similarly. Yeah.
Yeah, and we shouldn't think about like optimistic rollups being inferior to ZK rollups, because like in theory, both of these solutions should have the same security as layer one, but the devil is in the details, right? Like the problem that would probably the problem with the with some kind of hack or attack on the chain wouldn't be probably related to theoretical assumptions, but rather to some practical bugs in the implementation. And truth to be told, optimistic rollups are much simpler to implement, and that's why I think that this argument can be done in a totally opposite direction. Like ZK rollups introduce like all of this crazy math that no one understands, and so on and so on. So really, like, we shouldn't think about like optimistic rollups being less secure than ZK rollups as a side.
Until they settle. Once they settle, the 2-week window, they have the same risk perspective from what happened 10 days ago or a week ago on an optimistic rollup. 100% agreed. It's the security window between that. I don't remember what the technical term is. Whenever it's deemed like certain, finalized, and some of that. I mean, I've even heard that window is going to be compressing after the migration to proof of stake, where the economic equivalence goes down from whatever 10 days down to like 6 hours. And at that point, then I agree with you. The challenge is, and that's my only question, is that window of where it's not deemed as finalized, there is exposure. I just think it's
it's a bit more complicated than that, because like technical bugs can manifest themselves even after the rollup is finalized, right? Like it's much more difficult technical thing. Like this dispute period is just like an arbitrary time that people agree on, but like there can be implementation bugs that allow you to do crazy things. And while we're developing this solution from technical point of view, we assume that each domain can be totally malicious and can send like a totally untrue messages, cross-chain messages, and we're prepared to handle that. But coming back to the discussion about risk, like I think that risk management for wormhole feature itself, it's quite easy. But the problem is that if you have like MCD instances on Optimus, for example, on any domain, like then in theory, worst case scenario is that all the DAI that were in the bridge was stolen, and Collateral was also stolen. That Collateral that used to bug this DAI that was produced on layer 2. So potentially, like the losses, like we don't care about the Collateral that was for the DAI that was in the bridge, manually bridged by users, and that was stolen because it's still properly backed by some Collateral. But we worry about the DAI that was minted on layer 2, and then Collateral doesn't exist, or someone stole it, and we have basically unbacked DAI. So in cases like this, basically whatever was minted on layer 2, whatever was pre-minted on layer 2 is like our bad debt, and this can potentially be really hard to contain within a Cypress buffer or something like this. So yeah.
So could that possibly lead to a burn of the pre-minted DAI to back up the now uncollateralized DAI?
So on layer 1, we cannot burn like this DAI that was minted, right? Like it's just there and we cannot do anything. Like I assume, like I'm talking about situation when we pre-mint 100 million DAI, we send it to the bridge, and then somehow domain becomes malicious and sends like a malicious message to layer 1 bridge, like send this DAI to some address, right? And basically this address holds a DAI on layer 1 that it's uncollateralized. Like if the domain works properly, it should never happen, right? Because we have these guarantees. But of course, these guarantees, like from technical point of view, there can be a bug or something, and then we're screwed. But it's not about the DAI wormhole. It's about like DAI on MCD on different domains.
Well, wait a second. I think there's a clear answer, right? Is that you're right. The collateral disappears in the bridge, right? you could say that's somebody else's collateral we don't have to worry about, even though it's the backing collateral for the DAI. It's the DAI we have to worry about. And in such an event, when the system know that it has uncollateralized DAI out there, we basically have to burn from the surplus buffer and eat that loss. Either that or we're selling Maker and buying DAI and burning it, because
it's
Maker
a bad
basically
debt
has
for
to
us.
pull that off the market with its own assets to keep the collateralization neutral, right? Then in effect, we have to take that loss.
Yes.
And that's what we would have to do effectively, is we have to get DAI and then burn it against the DAI that was basically stolen or whatever, lost.
Yeah,
And
maybe, sir,
so-
maybe I misunderstood Jerry, but yes, this is basically bad debt, and this can lead to Maker print.
Yeah, but his point was that we're going to somehow have to burn that DAI with our own assets so that we can bring up the collateralization, or the better way to put it is to reduce the DAI in circulation to match the collateralization that we know is in effect, right? And so in principle, in this kind of event, Maker actually ends up eating the DAI loss because DAI's fungible. We don't have any control over it. I can't censor it. So we basically have to fill the collateral gap with our own assets, whether that's the surplus buffer or selling Maker or via some other mechanism. And so I think that's the clear point here, is that the DAI, L1 DAI in these L2 chains are exposed via bridges. And like Matt said, basically you have two issues that you also said. One issue is just the surface area of the bridge mechanics, right? That those could get hacked in different ways, different times. And the other one is the security, the closing of the loop on the security, right? When you get finality, then you can say, look, I finally closed the loop, like what Matt was saying. And he's saying that basically there's a latency loophole, right? That loop closing is when there's an open security attack, not just from the surface area of the protocol, but from the loop being closed and security. And so those are two things where we basically can lose that DAI, and that's where the hazard is. And that's what we have to weigh in terms of risk, right?
Yep, pretty much. I guess, as Kris said, though, there is dangers beyond just the fraud-proof window. It's not that simple. But yeah, definitely we need to evaluate the security model of the rollups, and yeah, we'll have to do that.
Now I had a question on that. So does that mean that effectively we're going to be forced to limit the DCs on these on every particular L2 to kind of what we consider our maximum exposure? Or, I mean, has risk weighed in on this in terms of how we manage this with DCs on these L2s?
Yeah, that'll depend on a lot of things. I mean, liquidity available on these L2s, like we just don't know yet. But yeah, I mean, we'll need to limit it and probably gradually increase, like we always with any other collateral. There could be a hack at any point, and so just do the best we can and sort of rely a little bit on Lindy effect. The longer these things go on without a hack, the more you can assume it's secure. But
yeah, and just to give you some perspective on Arbitrum, there's already like I think 3 billion worth of assets breached right from layer 1. So it's already like a pretty huge bug bounty that's sitting there.
I like that as a bug bounty. Now, have you guys talked to growth at all in terms of like what amount of DAI on these L2s is considered a good number for free flowing liquidity, right? I assume like 1 to 2 million is like nothing. 50 million maybe is a reasonable number. Does it have to be? Of course we want to grow it, but what is a reasonable number for some of these L2s in terms of giving decent DAI liquidity to be able to punch through here? What do you guys think, or what's the opinion?
I think that would be more a question for risk. I don't know, Primoz, you're on the call, and not to put you on the spot, but have you thought about this at all? Or maybe he's busy. No worries. Yeah, it's a question for risk. We're just doing technical side.
I mean, one thing I'll say, because I'm kind of working on a growth thing, because I kind of had a crazy idea of using, like, I really want to focus on Maker DAI V2 liquidity for a whole bunch of different reasons. But that I prefer that as a monetary unit versus Maker or DAI. And so there's this kind of crazy concept that you could take Maker DAI V2 liquidity and you could use it as like a tier 1 secure loan. against the die in these L2s. And so what we could do is we could make this V2AMM liquidity as kind of the backing liquidity, so that it has die in the contract, right? It can go up and down. It has maker that could be sold, and it could actually, in effect, if people could put enough in there and we did the right stuff with it, we use it as like the tier 1 liquidation against the assets. It stands as the secured collateral on the base, so that all maker doesn't have to come under the gun, just a sufficient fraction of it. And so it's the loosest way that you can kind of limit the losses, as to have like a tier 1 class that takes the hit before everything else does.
Yeah, interesting idea for sure.
So we're getting close to the end here. I wanted to kind of bring it back to Wormhole for a second. In terms of the timeline and stuff, has there been any updates on that since the last forum post? Or
yeah, I mean, we're aiming for Q1 2022 for the fast withdrawal. The general wormhole is going to take longer, and that's primarily because we have to get MCD on L2s as a prerequisite. So that's where the bulk of the work comes in. So we're shooting for Q2 2022 for that.
okay, great. And beyond Optimism and Arbitrum, are there any priorities in you guys' minds as far as where we should be launching MCD otherwise?
So I'm sure that Starknet is one of the more important areas of research right now. We even have like a core unit dedicated for that. So, and I think it's going pretty good there. But also like all other EVM compatible layer 2. So I guess ZK Sync soon, and perhaps Hermes Polygon, right? It's also gonna be EVM compatible. Like I personally believe that of course it's up to the governance at the end of the day, but I personally believe that DAI should be on any reasonable roll-up or layer 2 scaling solution out there, right?
Just on our side, Kris. So I'm the facilitator of the Starknet core unit. So we're gonna put a MIP for the January vote, if that's okay, and we're gonna ask for a budget for fast withdrawal and wormhole. Duly noted that delivery of the MCD on the first L2 for the PECU will be Q2, but we'll be aiming to develop in parallel.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, well, since we're at the top of the hour, I will say if anybody has any final questions, please feel free to jump in real quick. But otherwise, I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for doing this. This was fantastic. If you guys wouldn't mind giving some contact info for the best places people can reach you to follow up with further questions they might have.
Yeah, sure. Discord's probably best. Just Hexonaut. Just reach out. Yeah,
there's a public channel for protocol engineering, so you can find us there.
Perfect. Well, thank you, and thank everybody for coming.